Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We will go ahead and give our other attendees who registered just a few more minutes to join, so we'll start right after noon. Thanks so much. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for everyone for joining. My name is Danica Hobza, and I am the volunteer coordinator with ALRP. I just want to begin by thanking HIV Legal Services Fund of the American Bar Association, HIV and AIDS Impact Project. Their generous funds make it possible for us to bring you this training today. So first I'll go ahead and start with just a brief introduction to our organization, and then we will dive into the training. First, just a couple housekeeping items. We are going to be recording this training and uploading it as a resource to CLE Hero. So please do remain muted during the presentation. You should have received materials for the training from me by email. If you didn't get those, you can send me a message via the chat box and just let me know your preferred email as well. So we will be addressing questions throughout the presentation. You can submit those to us through the chat function or the chat box. That function is located in the Zoom toolbar. And we are a certified MCLE provider in the state of California. So we are glad to provide 1 hour of competency CLE credit to the California attorneys who are joining us this afternoon. Please do make sure you complete the evaluation that pops up after the training. It will pop up in your browser once you exit the training, and I'll also be sending out the link by email. We will need to have your completed evaluation on file in order to send you the certificate for CLE credit. This slide has our CLE Hero URL in case you would like to view any of the past trainings that we've done. We are so excited to be sharing this training with individuals and organizations across the country. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a little information about my organization. We were founded in 1983 in response to the AIDS epidemic. At that time, we were just 4 attorneys drafting wills and durable powers of attorney for our clients who were dying of AIDS. Drafting these documents allowed them to die with dignity and fulfill their wishes about healthcare and disposition of assets. As the needs of our clients have changed, so has our organization. And since 1983, we have handled over 80,000 matters for our clients. We offer direct services with our in-house staff attorneys, in addition to operating a lawyer referral panel. We have a very large and diverse group of pro bono attorney lawyers on our panel. Our staff and our panel handle hundreds of matters for our clients in a number of different areas: immigration, housing, and employment, to name a few. Our goal in offering these trainings is really twofold. First, we would like to increase the capacity of the attorneys on our panel and others who are supporting clients living with HIV and AIDS. In addition, we would really like to recruit new attorneys to our panel. And if you are in attendance today and you're not yet on our panel, we would really hope that you would consider joining. You can reach out to me directly, and my contact information will be on in a few slides. As an attorney on our panel, you really play a key role in helping us provide free or low-cost legal services to our clients. All that we ask is that our panel attorneys take on 2 referrals a year. You always have the option to either accept or pass on a referral depending on your availability. In addition, when clients first come to us, we complete a thorough intake with them so that we can make an informed decision and informed referral. There are numerous benefits to being on our panel, such as these free MCLE trainings, mentorship opportunities, networking opportunities, and malpractice insurance. So if you are interested in joining, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to walk you through the process or answer any questions. Now I would like to introduce our presenter for this afternoon, Jeena Cho. Jeena Cho is an attorney and the co-author of the best-selling book, The Anxious Lawyer, an 8-week guide to a joyful and satisfying law practice through mindfulness and meditation. She is a regular contributor to ABA Journal and Above the Law, where she covers resilience, work-life integration, and wellness in the workplace. She regularly speaks on women's issues, diversity, wellness, productivity, mindfulness, and meditation. Jeena joined our panel over a decade ago and has handled numerous pro bono cases for our clients. And while she's moved out of the Bay Area, she is still active with our panel. So we are thrilled to have her with us today to share her knowledge and expertise. Welcome, Jeena.
Hi, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here with me today, and thanks for having me. So I'm really happy to be here, and let me go ahead and share my slide and we'll get started. Oops. And I really welcome questions as we go along so that we can have more of a dialogue rather than sort of me talking at you for the next hour. So before we get started and before we do anything else, I want to just invite everyone to practice being here in this moment. So I know for myself, I've already had a very, very full morning. My 2.5-year-old is home with us. So both my husband and I are working from home with a 2.5-year-old. And for those of you that have kids or especially toddlers, you'll relate to the feeling of just that feeling of overwhelm. And I think that's also a fairly common experience as I talk to lawyers around the country. So I want to just invite everyone to practice being here in this moment. And let's just start by taking a few deep breaths. So breathing in. Oops. Breathing out. 2 more. Breathing in. And breathing out. And 1 more, breathing in. And breathing out. And then if you want to use the chat function to just share what you noticed by taking those 3 deep breaths, I would welcome that. And we'll talk a little bit about the physiology of stress and anxiety and why taking a few deep breaths can actually deactivate your nervous system as we go along. And if we were all sitting in a room together, and hopefully at some point that will happen more, I would actually have us go around the room and just share 1 word that describes how you're doing, but we'll do that virtually. And so I want to invite you to go to menti.com so you can just open up a browser on your laptop or on your phone and just go to menti.com. And when you get there, I'll prompt you for a code and to punch in the code that you see on the screen. So 95503490. I'll also put that information in our chat and just share 1 or 2 or just whatever comes up for you in terms of how you are in this moment, and recognizing that whatever it is that you're experiencing in this moment is of course subject to change, and it will change and ebb and flow and evolve, but just sort of welcoming ourselves into this moment as we are. All right, so I'll just wait just 1 more second and then I will pop on over and I'll collect all of our responses and we'll get to see a little kaleidoscope of all of the experiences that we're having right now. So let me share the results of our check-in. Okay, so the words that you see sort of in the bigger letters are the ones where there's that commonality. So I'm seeing busy and overwhelmed, sort of front and center, anxious, chilling, but also stressed, curious, cold. Yeah, I can relate to the feeling of being cold. I have my heater going on like full blast here. Optimistic, teeth clenched. As a fellow teeth grinder, I can relate to that. Distracted, open, tired, frazzled, interested, so productive, so welcoming, right? Whatever it is that you're experiencing in this moment. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with me. Okay, so let's talk about the status of lawyer well-being. Why is it that we are talking about mental health and lawyer well-being, like why does that matter? And I feel like nowadays there's a much more of a buy-in in the importance of maintaining lawyer well-being versus when I started talking about this topic, like, I don't know, 7-8 years ago. And one of the reasons is that we now have a lot more data around lawyer well-being. So, some of you may already be familiar with the study. It's a little bit old now, from 2016. It actually just feels like yesterday that they just released this data, but this is probably one of the largest data point in terms of lawyer well-being. And, not surprisingly, a lot of lawyers, around 28% are struggling with depression, 19% with anxiety, 23% with stress, and 21% are experiencing some type of struggle with alcohol use. Then to give you another data set from more recently, so this was done by the California Lawyers Association and also the Washington, D.C. Bar from 2020. So this was in the midst of the pandemic. And as you can imagine, right, these numbers are actually getting worse. So about half of the lawyers that were surveyed reported experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety. About 50%, slightly more than 50%, screened positive for risky drinking and potential alcohol abuse or possible dependence. Women lawyers are experiencing more mental health issues than men and are also engaging in more problematic drinking. And 1 in 4 women, I think this is, probably one of the most troubling, is 1 in 4 women lawyers are actually contemplating leaving the profession due to mental health issues, burnout, and stress. And 17% of male lawyers report the same thoughts. So, people often ask me, let me stop sharing my screen for a second. So people often ask me, like, how is it that you went from being a lawyer to teaching mindfulness and meditation and coaching lawyers? I want to just start by putting a little bit of context into the data points, right? Sometimes we can sort of look at data and feel like, oh, they're just data. But to actually put a personal story to the data. So I was once part of that data in struggling with an anxiety disorder and also depression. So about 7 years ago, I was diagnosed with social anxiety and also depression. And the journey in terms of how I got there is also a very long journey. And one of the, I think the thing that I learned through my recovery is that people, not just lawyers, but people struggle with anxiety disorders and depression for a really long time, on average, many, many years before they actually go and seek help. And that was certainly true for me. I used to, go to sleep thinking about work. I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking about work. And, the first thing that I thought about was work, first thing in the morning. And I never really thought that there was an issue with, just sort of having my mind constantly turning over work all the time and never really fully being able to disconnect from work. But I also started to notice that I was having a lot of anxiety and also just this feeling of mutedness, like the things that I would enjoy, or that sense of enjoyment, was missing from my life. But again, I didn't really think that there was any issues with that. And I remember there was one particular moment where I realized that something really wasn't right. I was driving to a hearing one morning. So I used to practice consumer bankruptcy law, and I was driving up to the court in Santa Rosa. And I remember I was just full of anxiety. It was one of those hearings where I knew I was going to lose. Losing also meant that my clients, husband and wife, would lose their home in the bankruptcy proceedings. And there was, nothing that I could do about it. It was in front of a judge that I did not want to be in front of. And it was an opposing counsel where, we were working on this issue for months and months and months. And it was just like every email exchange was just more aggressive or nasty than the last. So I was driving to the hearing, and it started to rain, and I drove by a scene of a car accident. And literally the first thought that popped into my head was, oh, wouldn't it be great if I got into a car accident? And my mind played out this entire fantasy of getting into a car accident, calling the clerk's office, the judge's chamber, and explaining the situation, and then having the ambulance show up and going into the emergency room and having the emergency room doctor look at me and say, oh no, you can't be on your phone doing work email. Like, you are just in a car accident and you really need to rest. And that idea of having another human being tell me that I needed to rest and giving me permission to rest actually felt like a reprieve. And then, of course, the next thought that popped into my head was, I'm such a terrible lawyer. Like, what good, competent lawyer have these thoughts? You know, these are not healthy thoughts, and I shouldn't have these thoughts. And I remember telling myself, like, I'm such a loser, and I'm such a bad lawyer, and I'm such a failure for having these type of thoughts. And, you know, that thought of getting into a car accident was evidence of, you know, just how bad of a lawyer I was. And a few weeks later, I was having lunch with a friend of mine, and she's a therapist. And for the very first time in my life, you know, I confided in another human being just how bad I felt on the inside. And, you know, and it was particularly hard because, you know, from an outward appearance, I think people saw me as being very successful, being really put together. But on the inside, you know, I just felt like I was like coming apart at the seams, and, you know, I was crying and very distressed. And of course, you know, her being a therapist, she very compassionately listened, and she said, you know, I really think that you need to go get help. And I said, what does help look like? You know, where do I turn for help? I don't even know what that looks like. Like, and what is this thing that I'm going through? Because I didn't even have a name for the experience. I just assumed that, you know, I should be able to like tough it up and, you know, just pull myself up by my bootstrap and just get things done. And she said, you know, there's nothing actually wrong with you. Like, you are a good, whole human being, but it just sounds like there are some tools and strategies that you need to learn and develop and practice so that you can manage your stress and anxiety better. And she recommended that I check out this anxiety management clinic at Stanford University. They were actually doing a study on anxiety disorders, so specifically social anxiety disorders, and looking at two different treatment options. So it was a blind study, and you were assigned to one of the treatment options. And so, you know, at like 3 a.m. on one of those mornings where I could not fall asleep, I went on their website and I filled out the intake questionnaire. And a few days later, they called me in, and I was diagnosed with social anxiety disorder and depression. And I remember that being one of the most scariest, but also one of the most isolating events of my life. I didn't know any other lawyers that were struggling with mental health issues. I really questioned whether, you know, I can be a good, competent attorney while still struggling with these mental health issues. I remember feeling ashamed, like I did something to cause this, and also, you know, just feeling so alone. And I went through the treatment program, and it was a group treatment program. And that was really helpful because I got to see other people's lived experience of, you know, how social anxiety manifested itself in their life. And you know, I started to get better. Like, I started to learn all of these tools for how to manage stress and anxiety, the importance of, you know, cultivating joy, the importance of taking really good care of myself, the importance of talking to myself kindly, and to figure out ways of course, you know, being there for my clients, but also setting boundaries. You know, as I mentioned, I used to practice consumer bankruptcy law. And one of the things, well, perhaps, you know, many things that we don't learn in law school is that we know that the profession, the work that we do can often be trauma inducing. And also, you know, like as lawyers, we are in the human suffering business. I mean, let's face it, like, you know, often people come to us because they are in deep distress. You know, that's certainly been my experience in, you know, all of my work, and also doing volunteer work for ALRP. And it's our job to get them from point A to point B, but also just the limitations of the law, right? Like, I remember just feeling so frustrated that, yes, I can get my clients to a point where they no longer are struggling with debt, but the circumstances that got them to my office, and often it's trauma, like unexpected illnesses or deaths, or business partnerships gone awry, or divorces, that I can't really restore them. And I had a hard time. The clients would come and share these incredibly trauma-inducing, incredibly like heartbreaking stories. And then I would just think about my clients all the time and just how sad it is. And I just didn't have a mechanism for witnessing their suffering and being there for it, but not completely losing myself in their suffering. And, interestingly, of course, therapists are also in the human suffering business. And one of the things that I learned in talking to my friend that's the therapist is that, they get so much training on the unintended consequences of the work that they do, right? Witnessing the suffering of others actually has an impact on you. It is really well studied. Secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, symptoms that look very similar to PTSD, burnout. And they get a lot of training on how to handle that and to recognize the symptoms and how to get support. Whereas in our profession, it's like the elephant in the room that no one is talking about. So at the end of the treatment program, we were encouraged to do the thing that we were afraid of. And one of the things that I was the most afraid of at that time was public speaking. I was really avoiding a lot of social contact in general. And I think it's because so much of my social contact, right, and dealing with my clients often induced trauma-like responses in myself. So then it makes sense that I was avoiding social contact. And so my sort of commitment to continue to heal and to overcome social anxiety was to do the thing that I was the most afraid of, and that was public speaking. So I made a commitment to do one presentation a month, which is a lot. And and when I kind of looked inside and said, what is the thing that I want to talk about? What is the impact that I want to make in the world? And what is the message that I want to bring forth into the world? I realized that, yes, I could talk about, sort of the substance of practicing bankruptcy law, but that really didn't have that like emotional appeal for me. The thing that I really wanted to talk about was lawyer well-being. I wanted to normalize the experiences of stress and anxiety, but also, to share the message that whatever it is that you're experiencing, whatever your coping mechanisms are, or the lack of the coping mechanisms, that it's not a sign of your competency as a lawyer. It's just that, again, it's like what my friend said, is that we were not taught these tools, and that we can learn them and we can learn to practice it. And I know for myself that these practices of mindfulness and meditation has been just like life altering. And I will definitely also share with you that I still experience stress and anxiety on a daily basis, right? Like when I learned this morning that my daughter is going to be staying home with us, it's like, oh, okay, so this is a reality now. But I can just recognize the stress and anxiety for what it is. It's a temporary event, and that it will pass, and that I have so many tools in my toolbox now to be able to work with that, right? So I can allow those moments of stress and anxiety to pass without continually fueling it with additional negative thoughts and, that like habitual mind thing that we all do. And also it kind of gave me an insight into the importance of, or, what it's like to live and practice law in a way that feels sustainable, that kind of fulfills that, that need that I have to, of course, make an impact and to make a difference, but also to be able to bring my whole self, like my creative self, my compassionate self, and to have fun, which I know is like, oh my gosh, we practice law, like there's no fun in our profession, and also to cultivate joy. So, that's really what I want to share with you in our presentation today, especially, as we come to this place of, coming to the end of 2021, and then also looking forward to 2022, and to just kind of carve out a little bit of time and space for reflection. Like all of us have been through so much in the past 20 months, right? And I think there's different levels of trauma that we have all experienced, and we're, I think, just starting to figure out, right? Like, of course, some of us are still in that trauma, but also a lot of us are trying to make meaning and to make sense out of all that's happened. So not only just the pandemic, but our reckoning with social justice and race and racism in this country, and also like the environment, like it's just like there's so many things that we're sort of contending with right now. And then in addition to sort of our personal and professional life, and I know for myself, my daughter was just a few months old when the pandemic started. Now she's a toddler. I'm also in that sandwich generation where my parents are, in their 70s, as my husband's parents. So there's just so many different layers of pressure points. And then it's like, how do we sort of find calm and that sense of equanimity in the midst of all that's happening, right? Again, and that practice of not losing ourselves in the storm of the stress and the sorrows, and also like not lose sight of the everyday joys and the everyday blessings. Okay, so let's get back to the slides.
Jeena, I'll just jump in with a quick question that was
Sure.
posted in the chat. Someone asked if you're part of the Lawyers Assistance Program. It's a help program at the State Bar. Are you aware?
I am not. It's one of those organizations that I fully support and believe in, and I talk to so many lawyers who have benefited, and so I will definitely put out a shout out for anyone who is who are struggling with mental health issues and addiction. But I am not. Thank you. Any other questions?
That's it for now. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. And yeah, I definitely welcome questions as we go along, or comments as well. Okay, so let's just pause for a moment and ask the question of like, why, right? Like why, I sort of gave you my why in terms of why it is that I struggled with mental health issues, but I'm also curious to hear from you, like why, why is there such a high rate of mental illness and mental health issues in our profession in comparison to other professions? And I think it's also interesting that when they've done studies for law students, for example, when law students start law school, their rate of mental health issue is on par with other professional and graduate program. But by 3L, the rate of depression and stress and anxiety and all the other mental health issues that we've been talking about is, just like exponentially increased. So I'll also put this information in our chat. And I would love to hear your perspective in terms of why. Oops, got an extra digit in there.
Jeena, I'll just chime in one more time while they're
Sure.
entering their thoughts here. I was looking at the chat. We did have someone make a comment when you were sharing the car crash anecdote. Someone commented they've had the exact same series of thoughts.
Yeah, and I will say, I've shared that story many, many times. So, I've done this presentation hundreds of times across the country. And, I will tell you at every presentation, someone will inevitably come up and say, I've had exactly the same thoughts or similar thoughts. Yes, and of course, right, if you are struggling with thoughts of self-harm, or just these distressing thoughts, just really, really important to get help. I think that's really my biggest message, is to get help, and that's one of my biggest regrets, is not getting help sooner, because it would have just been so amazing to have these tools in law school, for example, or elsewhere. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so I see Beth share stress of responsibility, fear of missing something critical to a successful outcome of your clients. Wonderful. Yeah, long hours, the learning process, and I think that's very true. There is a lot of like what I would call toxic mentoring in our profession. Often, this feeling like we can't bring our whole selves into our work, and the research seems to suggest not only in the legal profession but also elsewhere that people of color, seem to struggle with a higher rate of that feeling of not belonging. It's a self-perpetuating issue. Depression and anxiety lead to substance use, and then alcohol. Yeah, it's that right. It's that catch-22 stigma, and you being afraid to ask for help. Right. Yeah. On this point about we kind of take the smartest and the brightest of the bunch from college, and then we put them into the super hyper competitive environment. I remember my very first day of law school, the dean saying to us, look to your right and look to your right and look to your left because one of you is not going to be there. And by the way, like all the deans must just go to some like dean's training where they learn that, because I've also shared that story with lawyers and they're like, oh, my dean said the same thing. I don't know. Yeah, that toxic mentoring, heavy caseload. Particular focus on rationality and logic over emotions, overwhelming workload, lack of discussion related to mental health. Yeah, so thank you everyone for sharing the pie eating contest, right? Where you're gonna win the pie eating contest, you better make sure you really, really like pie. So thank you everyone for sharing that. So let's talk about stress and anxiety. Let's talk about the thing that we all came here to talk about. So stress. So let's start by defining stress. So stress is defined as a reaction to a stimulus that disturbs our physical or mental equilibrium. And there is like a fingerprint to the experience of stress, and it's going to look slightly different for every single one of us. I know for myself, when I feel stress, I notice my heart starts to beat really fast. I almost have that like tunnel vision like experience. My stomach tightens up, like it feels bad in the body when we experience stress. And when we look at this definition of stress, what you might notice is that really, the only part of stress that we have control over is our own reaction. Of course, we can have influence, right, over external stimulus, whether that be, opposing counsel or our spouse or our children, so on and so forth, but we don't necessarily have control over them. And we can't talk about stress without talking about its BFF, which is anxiety. So anxiety is the subjectively unpleasant feelings of dread over anticipated events. So again, anxiety, right, there is sort of that physiological reaction, but with anxiety is different from stress in that with anxiety, it's our mind thinking about some future event or some past event sometimes. So it's that anticipation of some future event. And as lawyers, of course, we are like hardwired to, of course, imagine the worst case scenario. Often our clients come to us and it is our job to give them the whole range of possibilities. One of the most insightful experience I had when I was going through the treatment program was I had some hearing coming up, and I was telling the therapist about just going on and on about all the horrible things that could happen if I lost this hearing. And she listened and she said, okay, I hear you sharing the worst case scenario. And she said, what do you think is the best case scenario? And I paused for a moment and I was kind of stumped by the question because that's not a question that I ever really asked. And I said, well, I guess the best case scenario is that I walk into the courtroom, make my appearance, Jeena Cho appearing on behalf of so-and-so. And the judge says, counsel, I've reviewed both parties' moving papers, and Ms. Cho, your motion's granted. And I walk out. And the therapist said, well, has that ever happened before? And I said, oh, yeah, sure, that's happened before. And she said, then why are you only thinking about the worst case scenario? And I thought, I don't know. Why do I do that? And it's because, it's a very well-known human phenomenon. There's a name for it. It's called the negativity bias, where we are hardwired to pay much closer attention to negative information than positive information. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes total sense. It is much, much more important to remember that that delicious looking red berry is going to make you very sick than it is to remember that that delicious looking red berry is in fact delicious. And, we sort of, and our legal training, I think, just takes the negativity bias to the next level. So let's talk a little bit about the physiology of stress. Right? So you might think back to your high school biology days, and there's basically two different modes in our nervous system. There's a sympathetic nervous system mode, which is also known as the fight or flight reaction. And then there's a parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of the rest and digest mode. Humans are designed to spend majority of its time in the parasympathetic nervous system mode, and our bodies are sort of designed that way. And, like from an evolutionary perspective, like there wasn't this contemplation of living in an era where we all walk around with these little stress releasing devices, right? Where we're like constantly releasing stress hormones into our bodies, or emails, or, the phone ringing. But what's interesting is that the fight or flight reaction it hasn't like quite evolved yet, right? To recognize that the text message doesn't actually pose a physical threat. Like we react to text messages and emails and all the other external stimulus in the very same way as like if someone is trying to bang down and break through our front door, right? And so you might notice like what happens in my body when I experience stress. And you can also share that in the chat. Like what are some of the telltale signs that you're experiencing stress? So I noticed that I had this cycle. Maybe I have a hearing scheduled, and then my mind would think about the worst case scenario. And then all of a sudden, my heart's beating really fast, my stomach's tightening, but I'm like triggering the fight or flight reaction in my body. And when that happens, right, that data, that those symptoms go up to the brain, and the brain is like, okay, what's happening? Like, why is the heart beating fast? And then I'm thinking, oh my gosh, then what if I lose the hearing? And my mind would always do this thing where it's like, I'm going to lose a hearing, and then I'm going to get sued for malpractice. I'm going to get disbarred, and then I'm going to become homeless. That was just my mind's like sort of irrational thought process. And then of course my heart then starts beating even faster, and my stomach's even tightening up even more, right? I'm like re-triggering the fight or flight reaction. Now it's sort of happening like throughout the day. So recognizing that, the fight or flight reaction, the sympathetic nervous system has been engaged. And then what are some tools and strategies that I can have in place to deactivate it? And perhaps even more important, what are the regular practices and habits that I have in place to engage the parasympathetic nervous system? What are the things that I can do on a day-to-day basis to like disengage, create an opportunity for my mind and body to rest, right? Not constantly thinking about work or the endless to-do list, and to like actually intentionally calm the nervous system. And the key, or one of the keys to that, is this idea or this concept of the body budget. So the body budget is a term coined by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's written like really interesting books. I highly recommend her books about our emotions and how it impacts the brain. So she does really interesting like neuroscience research. And one of the things that she observed, and I think this is kind of common sense really, is that our bodies, just like our financial budget, maintains a budget, right? So sometimes our budget's in the red, sometimes it's in the black. And when our body budget is full, we are much more able to handle the stressors in our lives. So just to use like a simple example, you think about the last time you really got a poor night's rest, then just how hard everything is the next day, or the last time you had the flu, right? Even the things that you would ordinarily like not be very bothered by ends up being really stressful. So, the thing to think about is, first, what do you notice when your body budget is in the red? I know, and you're welcome to share the responses to these questions in the chat. Like if we were sitting in a room together, I would have you go into breakout rooms, breakout groups and share. For myself, when my body budget is depleted, I become really impatient. And it's really easy to do when you have a 2.5-year-old, right? Like I'm less focused. The things that, would take me like 10 minutes, it takes me an hour. I feel, of course, I can feel the fatigue. And then also thinking about, what do you do to recharge your body budget? And for some of us, that's going to be like, oh, I do these 6 things every day, or I do this, I run every day, or, I go see a therapist, or whatever those things practice. I go for a walk, or I knit, or whatever those things may be. And for others, it could be like, oh, I don't know, when's the last time I like did something just for sheer pleasure? Or when's the last time I did something just for my own enjoyment, or because it's for my own well-being? So, wherever you may be on that spectrum, there can be this sort of natural self-judgment or guilt that comes up. So I want to just invite you to let that go, because this conversation is all about kind of planting the seed and then making like very small course correction, right, towards well-being. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But these are sort of the questions that I want to invite you to think about, especially as we're maybe thinking about New Year's resolution, then, how do we want to show up for 2022? And when we experience long periods of imbalance, when we have long periods of having our body budget be depleted, it leads to this vicious cycle. So when we're feeling stressed, it then, of course, taxes our immune system, and it releases more stress hormones, which then increases inflammation. And that leads to either actual illness, like, the cold, or, right, this feeling of feeling fatigued and sick. And then the body goes into conservation mode where, right, you feel more lethargic, you are sort of in that conservation mode. And then, of course, things like exercise and poor diet and sleep deprivation starts to kick in, can also lead to decreased social interaction. And then that then leads to the inability to handle stressful situations. It decreases our resiliency. And so it leads to this cycle.
Jeena, I'll share
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'll share just a couple comments that we've gotten through the chat function. So when we were discussing, how stress manifests in the body, someone shared it's like a pit in their stomach, tightness in the chest. When you were talking about the body budget, manifests as general fatigue, lack of interest, displeasure with everything. Versus recharging for that person means running, speaking with friends, sleeping, reading. We did have one other comment from an attendee mentioning that some of the content might be a little sensitive, and suggested posting the suicide hotline number in the chat, which I can go ahead and do that for us. We just had another chat come in. It's like a cinder block sitting on their sternum.
Thank you. Thank you for all the comments, and thank you for bringing the hotline into the conversation. And I also want to just apologize, because I think sometimes we can talk about these content and it can be very triggering. So yeah, I want to just name that, and also, again, emphasize the importance of caring for yourself. Yeah, and then I feel like I definitely should have offered a disclaimer in the beginning, so I apologize. Yeah, so all right, let's talk about the body budget, and different ways of recharging. I think one of the commenters kind of hit on almost all of these already. So sleep, right? Eating food that feels nourishing to you, exercising, connection with others, connecting with nature, connecting with that sense of awe and mindfulness. And so we'll spend the remainder of our time together talking about mindfulness and meditation. So when we talk about mindfulness, it is defined, there are many different definitions, but one of the definition is bringing clear-minded attention to and awareness of what is happening in the present moment. So we can show up for the many different activities of our lives with different feeling tones, right? With different levels of clear-mindedness. And so like really thinking about, what does that mean to show up with clear-minded attention? Again, that's, I think, noticing our bias, noticing our habitual thought patterns, and then also like grounding yourself in this moment. So when I'm doing the presentation, right, I definitely notice like my thoughts drift and think about other things, which is just a very common human condition. And to notice that and then return myself very gently to this moment. And I love this related definition by Tara Brach. And she says, not only accepting things as they are, so seeing things clearly, but also holding our experience with compassion. And I will definitely say when I first learned about the concept of compassion, I was like, oh my gosh, that is not for me. I'm a lawyer. Come on. There's no room in my life, in my professional life for compassion. And I think, that's a fairly common thought about, compassion. And as I learned more about compassion and the practice of compassion, I started to see the strength, this fierce strength that lies within compassion, and how compassion is oftentimes the only thing that we can offer in that moment. So for example, I mentioned I used to practice bankruptcy law, and the clients would often be very upset. They would be very distressed. There would be a lot of tears and just sorrow and heartbreak. And I know that my job as a lawyer, right, is to get them through the bankruptcy, and to protect them from the trauma of the bankruptcy to the extent that I can. And the other thing that I have to offer is compassion. So of course I can't fix the circumstances that led them to my office to begin with, but I can just acknowledge their experience, right? So compassion has these very four distinct elements. So one is the recognition of trauma or suffering. And second is to recognize that it is a common human characteristics. Even though my particular set of circumstances, my particular set of pain that I'm experiencing may be my own and unique to me, that there are others, right, countless others who are also experiencing similar set of circumstances, and that suffering actually is the thing that binds us. I can talk about it from the context of our profession, that the stress of being a lawyer, right, like sort of the nitty-gritty detail is unique to me, but there is this common recognition, this common theme that, just as I am suffering, with my law practice, like so are so many other lawyers. And then the third is to just notice, right, that very common human feeling of that compassion. It's a very, it's an innate characteristic. And then the fourth is to take some movement towards alleviating that suffering. So the practice of compassion really starts with the self. And that was the hardest lesson for me is, when, for example, when I'm procrastinating, and I used to do this a lot more And, I used to like procrastinate because I would feel completely stressed out about the thought of doing whatever that project is. But then because I was procrastinating, I would get then very upset with myself, and I would tell myself that I'm a failure, how I'm a terrible lawyer because I'm procrastinating, that it's going to lead to all sorts of consequences, and on and on and on. And I learned that with compassion, it's not like letting myself off the hook, right? So compassion isn't telling myself, oh, it's okay, Jeena, you don't really need to write that motion. Compassion is like recognizing like, oh, you know what, you're having a really hard time starting, and then creating space for the experience, and, bringing curiosity and saying like, why is it that I'm procrastinating? Thinking about it in terms of, if this was my best friend or a colleague that says, I feel so overwhelmed, I can't start on this project, what are the questions that I would ask? What are the advice that I would ask my colleague or my friend? And then taking some step, right, towards alleviating that suffering. And there are like lots of different books. Tara Brach has written some beautiful books about self-compassion, and we don't really have time to go into it in depth, but it is definitely something that I encourage you to practice, but to just learn more about. And we can't talk about mindfulness without talking about meditation. So meditation is training for the mind. Sometimes when I talk about meditation, we have these misperceptions about what meditation is. People think about like the monk sitting on mountaintop somewhere, like cross-legged. And really, for the purposes of our discussion, and also the way that the researchers typically study mindfulness and meditation, we're looking at the actual impact on the brain. So one of the reasons that why I think there is so many excitement and discussion around mindfulness and meditation and how it impacts our well-being is that we can literally see how these ancient practices changes your brain. And I think that is so exciting, right? So, anxiety and stress, of course, like lives, of course, in the body, but also in the brain. And part of the brain that is responsible for the fight or flight reaction, which we talked about earlier, is the amygdala. And, I like to think about the amygdala as like the smoke detector in our brain. And of course, we want the smoke detector to go off when there's actual fire or smoke, but that the smoke detector has become miscalibrated, right? Because there's so many different external circumstances and stimulus that seem to trigger the stress response. So it's sort of like going off all the time, even though it's not an actual danger or physical threat, it's just become hyperactivated. And so what the neuroscientists are finding is that through regular meditation and mindfulness practice, and I want to underline that word regular, is that we can actually rewire our brain to experience less stress and anxiety. And so meditation impacts actually lots of different parts of the brain. Again, we don't have time to go into it. There's a really good book called The Buddha's Brain, which really goes in depth into how meditation changes your brain. But I think for our purposes, this is the part that I want to share with you, is that you can train your brain to be less reactive, and to have that sense of buoyancy, that to have that sense of equanimity. So you're not constantly being swayed by, all the different events of your life. There's that feeling of like stability that we can cultivate. One of the most common questions I get from lawyers is, okay, how long should I do this for? And I will say that there's no particular prescription for how long you should meditate for, but the good place to start is 2 minutes a day. And sometimes when I say 2 minutes a day, I get this look like, really, that's too easy. And I want the commitment to be actually really easy, because it makes it more likely that you'll do it. Sean Egger, who has done a lot of research on the topic of not only just mindfulness meditation, but cultivating happiness, his research shows that 2 minutes a day for 21 days is enough to see the many benefits that we have been talking about, and we'll talk about for the duration of our time together. So 2 minutes a day for, let's say, a month, right? So it's actually much better. You'll actually see more results meditating for 2 minutes a day for 30 days than you will, let's say, meditating once a month for 1 hour, even though you're meditating for the exact same period of time. It seems that the actual amount that you meditate for on any given day doesn't matter nearly as much as the consistency of the practice. And I think that's probably true for, any of our well-being activities, whether that be, walking every day, right? Or eating healthy every day. So I want to invite you to really think about it in these short bursts. So like, what if you want to be an overachiever, you can do it for 6 minutes a day, so 0.1 hour, of the hundreds and hundreds of hours that you dedicate to others. What would it be like to carve out a single 0.1 hour for your well-being? And again, like everyone's going to be on the spectrum and different in terms of where they are in their well-being journey. So if you're already spending, more than 6 minutes a day on your well-being, that's wonderful. But if you're like, oh, this is an area of my life that's been neglected, then I just invite you to start just by, starting with 2 minutes a day. So now I want to invite everyone to, and we'll just do it for like a minute or two, a very short meditation practice. And so in order to meditate, we don't need any special tools or equipment. The only thing that you need is your mind and body. And fortunately for all of us, we have that handy. So let's get started. Let's start by finding a comfortable seated position. And if it feels good to you, you can allow your eyes to close, or you can allow your eyes to just have a soft gaze. So you can find this spot 2 to 3 feet in front of you and gaze softly at that spot. Notice what it feels like to invite yourself to slow down just a little bit for these few minutes. And this is a very gentle invitation. So we're not forcing, we're not demanding. It's almost as though you're reaching out and extending a hand to someone that is very dear to you and say, hey, have a seat. Sit with me for a moment. And so this practice of being kinder to yourself, of being a good friend to yourself, and now let's very gently bring the attention to the breath, so feeling the body breathing in and out. Right. Gently remind yourself that in this moment, in this particular moment, there is nowhere else to be and nothing else to do except to simply sit here and breathe. And in a moment, we'll close the practice. But before we do, I invite you to check in and see if there's something that you would like to carry with you from this practice, something that you would like to take with you from this practice, or perhaps something that you would like to leave behind. And now let's close the practice by wiggling the fingers and toes and stretch in any way that feels good to you. And whenever you feel ready, allow the eyes to open. So I welcome any thoughts or observations or questions about those few minutes of practice. I'm curious to know what came up for you. Always interesting, and also curious to know if you're a regular mindfulness and meditation practitioner, or if you're an aspirational practitioner, or perhaps you're new to the practice. It would be fun to just kind of gauge where everyone is at. Yeah, so what did you notice? What did you observe? I welcome the questions and comments. And so when we meditate, what we're practicing is coming back to this moment, and it gives us the tools that we need to be a little bit less stressed, calmer, and kinder to ourselves and others. And especially now, as we are in this period of transition, right? For many of us, like a lot of us are transitioning back to the office. And because of the experience of the past 20 months, right, this practice of being kinder to ourselves and others, it's just so especially helpful because, we don't know, right, exactly the details of what other people have gone through, and to like really extend that practice of grace to ourselves and others.
We have a couple, one question and one comment. So first, the question, do you have any thoughts or comments on quiet meditation versus active meditation? For example, a yoga practice.
Yeah, I think, really you are going to be the best teacher for yourself. I do both, and I find both to be really beneficial. And, both has its functions. I will say that a lot of the meditation, or sorry, the yoga classes, it really doesn't leave like a whole lot of space for quiet meditation at the end. So that is something that, I do observe just about like or yoga classes in general. But, yoga was actually developed or practice so that we can calm our bodies enough to be able to do the sitting practice. So like the two are interrelated. And sometimes like when you try to sit down and meditate, like there's a lot of active energy in the body. So yoga is really helpful for finding calm in the body. So I think you can try both, but that those two things are just really integrated. And I think because of the way that we tend to practice it here in the West, like those two things have sort of become like a little bit disjointed or kind of separated from its root origin. So those are my thoughts on that. And then the comment.
Yes, so another attendee shared that they were surprised to see how those few minutes made them feel so much better, and they will definitely carve out some time each day for meditation.
Wonderful. Yeah. And there are, so many different apps out there now that makes meditation super accessible. My book, The Anxious Lawyer, has guided meditations contained in it. And there's audio recording of both myself and Karen Gifford, Gifford, who is the co-author. So if you enjoy sort of like my meditation and my voice, you can also find the information on my website. And so there are like so many different reasons for practicing mindfulness for lawyers. So I'll touch upon a few of these. And the first one is really begin to recognize our own boundaries, whether we actually communicate it to others or not, but actually recognizing those boundaries for ourselves. The second is it's a place to retreat. The work that we do can be really hard. It's like a place of like reprieve and retreat. Third is corrective measure, like when we're noticing we're out of balance or that we've been working too much or we are losing that work-life balance, which like I really don't like that term, but we can begin to put into place corrective measures. It's definitely a way to combat vicarious trauma It can put into perspective our lived experience and also help us reframe what it is that we're thinking about. Again, it's a way to combat that negativity bias. And it's a way to not just have be reactive, but more responsive to all the external stimulus. We already talked about compassion. Lots of different research shows that people that practice mindfulness and meditation seem to be able to access their creativity more. And finally, acceptance. There's so much about our law practice that is beyond our control. So this is a way to accept those things that we cannot change. Let me just skip this. So when we meditate and practice mindfulness, we can begin to notice these habitual thought patterns. One of the thought patterns that was just so deeply ingrained in me was this feeling of not being good enough. So, all the different variations of not being good enough, not being smart enough, I don't belong here. And, I'm sort of, I'm a fraud that at any moment now, everyone else is going to find out just how bad I am. All of those thoughts that were always sort of running and humming beneath life as it was unfolding. And I started to see oh, all of those thoughts, aren't true, but also how destructive those thoughts are. And, of course, there's a name for it. It's called the imposter syndrome. And when I started practicing mindfulness, I started to see those thoughts, and then to be able to see how those thoughts were untrue, but also to create different thought patterns. So, we have these very well-worn neural pathways that are created in our brain. Right? Probably a lot of them came from our childhood. And we can actually create new neural pathways so that when A happens, I may habitually think B and C, but that we can create different thought patterns that are more helpful to us, that are more sustaining. So you might begin to actually challenge those thoughts and say, is this thought helpful? Is this thought productive? Is this the voice of the inner critic or the imposter syndrome? And finally, this is one of my favorite questions to inquire is, if this was my best friend, if this was my child, if this was somebody that I really care about, what would I tell him or her? And my guess is whatever you tell yourself is probably going to be very different than what you tell others. So, being able to extend that sense of grace, being able to practice being kinder to ourselves.
Another comment and another question, if we have some time. Someone commented that critical thinking is different from constant worrying, and that many of us seem to be impacted by imposter syndrome. And then someone did ask the question, why don't you like the term work-life balance?
Yeah, and to me, it creates this false dichotomy, false separation that there's work and there's home, whereas I think for many of us, the two are just so intertwined. My day isn't I spend, 8 hours doing work or, 9 or 10 hours doing work, and then I do my home stuff. It's usually a ping pong of both of those things. And I want to live a life where both of those things are truly integrated. So I don't know, maybe a better term for me is work-life integration, right? So for example, this morning, today, I spent the morning with my daughter, but then I had work calls in between, and I'm doing this presentation. And then this afternoon, we're going to go do some shopping, and then I'll get some work done in the evening. And for many of us, I think our life sort of, looks that way. So what is it like to actually embrace both, to create space and time for both, and to value both? Yeah, and there's so much more I can say about that, but I think I'll just pause there just for time. So I want to just leave you with few concrete strategies for integrating mindfulness and meditation or mindfulness into your daily life outside of the formal practice of meditation. So one is mindful eating. I know like when I survey the room, if we're like physically sitting, I would survey the room and I would say, how many of you eat lunch at your desk every day? And like 95% of the people will raise their hand. And so really thinking about, the activities that you do on a day-to-day basis, like eating, showering, changing your clothes or washing your hands, and using those as an opportunity to engage the parasympathetic nervous system. So when you're eating, right, to just eat and not, do email or, right, because when you do that, like you're feeding your mind potentially with stress while you're trying to nourish your body. And this was a really helpful practice for me, as even if it's just 10 minutes that it takes me to sit down and eat a meal, to really look at the food, smell it, to savor it. That's one practical way to integrate mindfulness. And another tip that I want to share with you is this practice of stop. So sometimes our mind, or somebody mentioned, there's a difference between productive thinking versus just like rumination or worry. But our mind, sometimes it feels like it has sort of a mind of its own, and it does worry and ruminate. And so this is a tool that you can practice to kind of invite the mind to stop the rumination. So the technique is called stop. So the next time you sort of catch yourself doing that endless thought loop of or doom scrolling maybe on your phone, you can invite yourself to stop and then take a breath. So breathing in, breathing out, and then observing. So observing whatever may be going on inside of you and around you, and finally proceeding mindfully. So I am going to actually skip a bunch of slides because I'm noticing our time together. And I'll close with this, right? Secure your own oxygen mask before helping others. Taking really good care of yourself, while sometimes it can feel selfish, it really isn't. When we practice self-care, like all the things under the umbrella of lawyer well-being, what we're really doing is securing our own oxygen mask, or filling our own fuel tank, or all the different sayings, right? Like you can't pour from an empty vessel. Secure your own oxygen mask before helping others. So if you have any questions, or if you're interested in any of my training or coaching, you're more than welcome to reach out to me at hello@jeenacho.com. And I will just pause here for any final questions or comments.
Thanks, Jeena. We did have one last question come in. Some big firms have backed off billing practices, but billing is still very common. How can you manage when there is an external force, bill or get fired, when that is ever present?
Yeah, and I don't think this is a question we're going to really be able to solve or address in the next couple of minutes. I think this is really a systemic issue that we need to actually start to have a more holistic conversation about, is like, how do we, what does truly integrating work life look like, and how do we actually carve out space for both? And I can't remember the author, but there's a really good book, and the author used this term called greedy work, which is what the question is alluding to, is this expectation that you be available completely and fully 24/7 for work, which is why it's called greedy work, and that just isn't sustainable. And I think it's going to really require the collective of us to set boundaries and to have conversations about what does it truly look like to create a workplace that is sustainable. And I also feel like that this is the perfect moment to start to have these, important conversations, and as people are also like quitting, right? I mean, that's one of the big things that's happening right now, is people are actually leaving their jobs because the work, they can't seem to create space for being able to do both. But I definitely want to just honor and say like that is a really important question that I think we all need to collectively answer and address. Okay, so
Great.
so I want to just thank ALRP. It's an organization that is just near and dear to my heart, and I want to encourage all of you to volunteer for them. And thank you so much for carving out time to join me for this presentation today.
Great. Jeena, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of our attendees who joined us. Definitely don't forget to complete the short evaluation for CLE credit and stay tuned for our 2022 calendar of events. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.